Aspectus Memoria, with the support of Lithuania's Press, Radio and Television Foundation, presents In memory of the public officials of the Independent Republic of Lithuania, murdered but not forgotten. The fatal year of 1940. On June 15, 1940, Lithuania was overrun by military units of the Soviet Army. A month later, on July 23rd, Lithuania's top-ranking security and intelligence officials were secretly taken from this particular place and brought to Moscow. Former Interior Minister, retired Brigadier General Julijonas Čaplikas. Chief of the 2nd Department of Lithuania's General Staff, Konstantinas Dulksnys. Chief of State Security and the Criminal Police of Marijampolė District, Jonas Kazlauskas. Deputy Chief of Military Intelligence and Counterintelligence, Petras Kirlys. Povilas Spiridonovas Lašas, who worked in state security from 1919 to 1930. The President of the Military Tribunal, Silvestras Leonas. Emergency Officer of the General Staff, Juozas Matusaitis. Former Director of the State Security Department and General Secretary of Lithuania's ruling party, Jonas Statkus. Director of the Department of State Security, Augustinas Povilaitis. Interior Minister, retired Brigadier General Kazimieras Skučas. Train of Duty. Chapter 1. Kazimieras Skučas. This is my father. His name is Pranas Skučas. Here is a nesting box taken from our Christmas tree in Siberia. Because my father always loved birds. Above him is a picture of his brother, Kazimieras Skučas. He was Interior Minister and a Brigadier General. General Kazimieras Skučas used to be in this picture as well. But his head has been cut out of the picture. He is wearing a Lithuanian military uniform, and probably my parents were afraid of being deported by the Soviets for possessing such a photo. Following the second Soviet occupation, mass deportations began, and my parents went into hiding. They lived on the run until January 1952, when we were all exiled to Siberia, along with this picture. I didn't know who was in this picture until we returned to Lithuania. We came back when I was 10 years old.
Kol grįžom į Lietuvą, aš nežinojau, nes grįžau gal tik tai 10 metų.
Kaunas, April 4th, 1934. Dear Mr. Interior Minister, we are in need of representation at our embassy in Moscow. We nominate Colonel Kazimieras Skučas to fill this position. Colonel Kazimieras Skučas. Religion, Roman Catholic. Nationality, Lithuanian. Family status, married. Education, Vevere Teachers Seminary, Chuguyev Military School in Russia, Vytautas the Great Officer Training School, and Senior Military Officer Training. On January 15, 1919, joined the 1st Infantry Regiment, became Commandant of the city of Alytus on February 6th, appointed military commandant of Marijampolė municipality on March 1st, promoted to captain November 18th, assigned deputy chief of the 10th Infantry Regiment, became battalion commander, and was promoted to major and chief of operations in the general staff, promoted to lieutenant colonel, and appointed lecturer at Vytautas the Great Officer Training School. Appointed commandant of Kaunas Garrison. Appointed head of the 2nd Division and commander of Kaunas Garrison. Promoted to colonel. As commandant was active in combat operations. Awards. Cross of Commander, 3rd degree of the Order of Vytautas the Great. Cross of Commander, 3rd degree of the Order of Lithuanian Grand Duke Gediminas, 10th anniversary of Lithuanian Independence Medal. Medal of the Founding Volunteers of the Lithuanian Military. Czechoslovakian Order of the White Lion, 3rd degree. Latvian Wars of Liberation 10-year anniversary commemorative medal. Posthumously awarded the Order of the Vytis Cross in 2006, presented to his grandson, Kazys Šukis. But let's return to 1934. Captain Bobelis called us from Supreme Military Headquarters. He asked us to delete the part about Kazimieras Skučas' combat activities, as these were directed against the Bolsheviks. To Jurgis Baltrušaitis, Lithuania's special envoy to the USSR. Get permission from our military attaché in Moscow, Kazimieras Skučas. Dovas Zaunius, Lithuania's foreign minister, 1929 to 1934. In May 1934, Colonel Kazimieras Skučas was sent on a diplomatic mission to Moscow, where he spent almost 4 years working as Lithuania's military attaché and got to know the Soviets in various contexts. After he came back to Lithuania, in early spring of 1939, he was promoted to brigadier general and was offered the position of interior minister in the government of General Jonas Černius. He continued in this position under Prime Minister Antanas Merkys. Moscow, the Kremlin, August 23, 1939. After the fall of Poland and the changes in the political situation, our government is focusing its efforts on recovering Vilnius. On October 7, 1939, a delegation from Lithuania was dispatched to Moscow to deal with this matter. The delegation consisted of Deputy Prime Minister Bizauskas, Foreign Minister Urbšys, Head of the Armed Forces Brigadier General Raštikis, and Director of the Department of Economy Norkaitis. On October 10, 1939, Lithuania signed a mutual assistance and cooperation agreement with the Soviet Union, regaining Vilnius and its surrounding regions, previously occupied by Poland since 1920. But the agreement was a Trojan horse. Lithuania agreed to allow 20,000 Soviet troops to be stationed within its territory. Soon it became clear that this was the first step in the well-planned occupation of Lithuania, which was to claim the lives of thousands, derail Lithuanian independence, and alter the moral and political face of the country. Kazys Skučas was born in 1894 in Mauručiai village, Marijampolė district. He was the son of Juozas Skučas and Gertrūda Furmanavičiūtė. It was a very large family, 14 children. 5 of them died while they were still very young, which left the family with 9 children who grew to adulthood. Kazimieras was the eldest. His parents decided to provide him with an education, so he graduated from the well-known Veveriai Teachers Seminary and left for St. Petersburg, where he was accepted into the Teachers Institute, but was unable to complete his studies due to being drafted into the Tsarist Russian army. I have a picture of him in Chuguyev, where he graduated from military school and saw action on the front lines of various battles. In 1918, he returned to Lithuania and became a volunteer in Lithuania's armed forces. As the Great Soviet Encyclopedia notes, in 1940, Augustinas Povilaitis, in collaboration with German fascists, organized acts of espionage and provocation against Red Army units stationed in Lithuania. Similar things are said about Kazys Skučas as well. Both men knew about underground Soviet activities in Lithuania.
Kai 1939 metais Lietuva pasirašė 39 spalio 10 dieną.
On October 10, 1939, after Lithuania signed the Mutual Assistance and Cooperation Agreement with the Soviet Union, Kazimieras Skučas said to his brother Pranas, "So begins the occupation."
Paskutinį kartą jį mačiau 40 metais, kada mes gyvenom Panevėžy. Jis buvo atvažiavęs su
In 1940, I saw him for the last time. Back then, we lived in Panevėžys. He, his wife, and younger daughter Jūratė were visiting us during the Easter holidays. The atmosphere that Easter was depressing. The men were smoking in my father's study. Smoke was pouring out from under the closed door. I remember hearing my father tell my mother, "Kazys had told me that this is it. It's the beginning of the end." And he was right. He had serious reasons for saying so. His words were coming true almost immediately. Soon, the Soviet news agency TASS announced that Soviet soldiers stationed in Lithuania were being kidnapped. On May 24th, the German military surrounded Allied troops near Dunkirk. It seemed the Germans had won the war in the West. The following day, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov presented Lithuania with a diplomatic note accusing the Lithuanian government of abducting soldiers from Soviet bases in Lithuania. Foreign Minister Juozas Urbšys believed the Soviets, for reasons unclear, were looking for ways to corner Lithuania. The pressure from the Soviets was growing. For the Baltic states, their darkest hour was upon them. On June 7th, the Soviets accused the Baltic states of forming a secret military alliance against the USSR. On June 12th, Antanas Merkys returned from Moscow after delivering materials regarding an official investigation of the accusations. Molotov gave no regard to the materials. To reduce tensions in the relationship with the USSR, Lithuania's government asked Skučas to resign and fired Augustinas Povilaitis. On June 13th, the eve of the Soviet occupation, Lithuania was celebrating President Antanas Smetona's name day. The official proclamation contained words of hope that Lithuania's head of state would succeed in preserving the country's freedom during these tumultuous times. Smetona in the presidential palace. The president told his wife, Sofia, "We and our children, our government, and many others shall soon have to flee Lithuania while fighting Moscow's violence together with our military." These words were uttered by the president on June 13th. The following evening, while the world watched in horror as the Wehrmacht occupied Paris, Foreign Minister Molotov delivered an ultimatum to Lithuania's Foreign Minister Urbšys. Hand over authority to Soviet-approved officials. Refusal would result in a military takeover of Lithuania. On the same day that Paris capitulated, Stalin, the Soviet Union, gave Lithuania's government an ultimatum. Urbšys sent a telegram to Kaunas, which stated, "At 12 a.m., Molotov delivered an ultimatum, First of all, to hand over Skučas and Povilaitis for trial. Second, to form a Soviet-approved government. Third, to immediately allow more troops into Lithuania to be stationed at key points. Stop. A response is expected this morning by 10 a.m., Moscow time. Stop. Failure to respond will be considered refusal. Full stop. It seems if Skučas and Povilaitis were to flee, this would aggravate the situation. Underlined. Urbšys. And here they were faced with a dilemma. accept the ultimatum or reject it. The entire government gathered for an urgent meeting. The cabinet was assembled within 2 hours. The current head of the armed forces, as well as the former head, General Stasys Raštikis, were also present. The meeting lasted approximately 4 to 6 hours, including a break. Though there was a variety of opinions, the majority were inclined to accept the ultimatum. President Smetona spoke in favor of resistance. I categorically disagree. It would be a disgrace not to resist at all. Yet the majority were hesitant. Prime Minister Merkys stated, "I believe we should accept all the demands. Later, we might be able to soften them." The final decision was made after the Prime Minister and both current and former heads of the military, Vitkauskas and Raštikis, endorsed the idea of complying with the ultimatum. The government had decided not to resist. In his notes on the meeting, President Smetona wrote, "The Defense Council agreed in its entirety that if there were ever to be a serious threat to Lithuania's freedom, we must fight with all means available, including weaponry, though there be no chance of winning." Taken from Pro Memoria by Antanas Smetona. At least that way, every Lithuanian would know that we did the best we could to defend our honor. What do you think of the position of the president and government regarding the two state officials, Skučas and Povilaitis? It might seem unethical to raise the question today. Perhaps in their shoes we would have made the same choices, but perhaps they should have decided differently. Can we judge their decision from today's perspective? I believe that President Smetona was extremely principled, because he was well aware of the fact that Director of the State Security Department, Augustinas Povilaitis, and Interior Minister Kazys Skučas were authorized to act in the name of the government and the President until June 15th. They were only following political orders and were not acting on their own. They were following the policies of the government and the president. Smetona knew that if they were to give in to Soviet pressure to arrest these officers, it would mean the betrayal of the entire government and the presidency. This was the reason Smetona was against accepting the ultimatum. He knew they would have to arrest their own officials. Smetona acted logically and consistently. It was legally impossible for the government to punish officials for implementing the government's own policies. That would be simply impossible. Prime Minister Merkys brought Skučas into the first session around 1 a.m. I know this from his wife, Stefania Skučienė, who wrote this in her memoirs and sent me a copy that an American magazine had published. So at around 1 a.m., Skučas was invited to the session and informed of the Soviet ultimatum. He came home and was asked to return at around 7 a.m. The session was already over. The ultimatum had been accepted. President Smetona advised him to leave the country as soon as possible. Skučas refused, saying that if he left, others would suffer the consequences. At that moment, the president presciently said to him, "Sacrificing yourself won't do anyone any good." At 9 a.m. that morning, the General Staff got an order to give the occupying army a friendly welcome. This order was announced and repeated on the radio phone. At around 3 p.m., the Red Army crossed the Lithuanian border. The takeover was peaceful, although the Soviets were ready to use any means necessary, including diversionary and terrorist tactics. Recently, the very instructive memoirs of GRU Major Guskov were published in Moscow. Here was the first written evidence confirming that Soviet diversionary intelligence teams had been sent to various Lithuanian cities by bus. Members of these groups had forged Lithuanian documents, maps, and knowledge of the local language. Guskov's assignment, as I understand it, was to neutralize local police forces in the small provincial town of Zarasai. They had prepared two plans for Lithuania, Plan R and Plan G. The former stood for Plan Russians, and the latter for Plan Germans. They were prepared in case of any attack. Also, there was a third plan called Plan P, which referred to Poland, but it was shelved after Poland no longer existed. Though military plans had been prepared, there were never any orders to execute them. High-ranking officials understood what was about to happen to them and quickly made plans to depart Lithuania. The first sort of political refugee was Edvardas Turauskas, director of the Foreign Ministry's political department, who fled alone and took as many secret ministry documents as he could fit in his car. They contained names of those who were working with Soviet and communist agents after the ultimatum had been accepted. Skučas asked the government to allow him and Povilaitis to accompany their families to the German border. Prime Minister Merkys even offered them the use of the ministry's automobile. Skučas pledged on his honor that they would not flee the country without the government's permission, and they were allowed to make the trip.
Mama pasakė, kad kaip jai buvo, kaip ją atsimena. Vieną dieną ją buvo kambary jos.
My mother recalled that her father came and told them to pack their most important belongings and be ready to leave in 30 minutes.
Buvo 3 valandą. Jis atbėgo ir sakė, nu, reikia.
They left around 3 p.m. and headed towards the border with Germany.
30 minučių mes einam į mašiną ir reikia važiuoti į sieną.
They decided to drive to Giedrė village, where Povilaitis had a farm. Povilaitis had already sent his family there from Kaunas, so only Skučas' family was with him. Back then, Skučas' family lived near Seneva cemetery. Before they left home, the phone rang. Merkys called to remind Skučas about his pledge. Povilaitis and Skučas left their homes in separate cars. Povilaitis had a telephone on his farm. After both men heard that the Soviet army had crossed the border, they called the government in Kaunas, but nobody answered. Then the two men decided to drive to Pašventys, where they again attempted to contact the government from a border post and the post office, again unsuccessfully. After that, they went back to Giedrė, picked up their families, and drove back to Pašventys on the German border. They stayed near Pašventys High School. In Pašventys, they found out that around 2 p.m., the government had ordered the borders closed. Top secret. Dear Mr. Interior Minister, there are suspicions that former Interior Minister Kazys Skučas and Director of the State Security Department Augustinas Povilaitis committed a crime against Soviet soldiers, and therefore they must be arrested. I request that you implement this order with all possible haste. Signed, Minister of Justice Tamošaitis. Please order the police to arrest them. Signed, Merkys. To the police reserve, implement.
Prieš tą jis gavo skambutį.
Before that, he got a call from Prime Minister Merkys. He asked Skučas not to hurry and to wait at the border. There will be people who will accompany you, help you and your family, will protect you when you get to the other side of the border.
Čia žmonės su tavim ir familija pagelbės ir važiuos su tavim, tada dabos tave, kada nuvažiuos tave į kitą pusę sienos.
Mokyklos kieme pasirodė automobilis policijos rezervo, iš kurio iššoko.
A police car appeared in the schoolyard. 5 or 6 armed officers jumped out and surrounded Skučas, guns pointing at him. Seeing what was happening, Povilaitis fled the scene.
Netoli buvęs Povilaitis dingo greitai iš kiemo.
Išlipęs mašinos ir mano mamytė sakė.
According to my mother, Skučas exchanged greetings with the policemen and said he was delighted to see them. They apologized and said that they must return him to Kaunas.
Ar gal vežti atgal.
Ta popietė birželio 15 dėdė su šeima, 2 vaikais ir žmona atbėgo iki mūsų.
At noon on June 15th, my uncle and his family came running to our house here in Pašventys. His home was nearby, maybe 200 meters from our house. In our barn, we had a big chest that held flour for the animals. My mother hid her sister-in-law in that chest. As for me and my cousins, she told us to go to the forest and gather wild strawberries. She was probably worried that they would arrest not only my aunt, but her children as well. Meanwhile, my uncle was running along the woods towards the river Šventoji. He expected to cross the German border and hide out among the Germans. Let's go to the river so you could show us the exact place.
Mes esame prie Šventosios upelio, kuriuo kada vokiečiai užėmė.
Here we are near the river Šventoji, which used to be the Lithuanian-German border after the Germans annexed the Klaipėda region.
Išbėgęs iš mūsų namų, pamiške atbėga iki šitos vietos ir jau ruošėsi per šventąją šokti.
After my uncle ran from our home, he rushed here and was about to jump into the river when border officer Krivickas showed up and pointed a gun at him. My uncle also had a gun, but he didn't use it.
Aš esu Romualdas Povilaitis.
I am Romualdas Povilaitis. The last time I saw my father, I was 8 years old. He was the director of the State Security Department, and he waited until the last moment.
Su juo buvau kartu, davė ultimatumą, kad taip ir mes norim Augustiną Povilaitį ir norim...
Kazimieras Skučas was together with my father on the day the Lithuanian government received the ultimatum, which required the arrest of both of them in order to avoid more Soviet soldiers entering Lithuania.
Sovietų sąjunga neužims Lietuvą, jeigu jis pasiduos. Tėvas jau buvo...
My father thought that maybe, if they gave themselves up, the Soviets wouldn't take over the country.
Motina pamatė, kad atvažiavo didelį juodą...
My father had already taken us to his homestead near the German border before he and Skučas arrived. My mother was standing on the hill when she saw a large black truck. She started screaming desperately, warning my father to run before they could get him. My father could have easily shot the Lithuanian officer, but he chose not to. He did not run away, and they arrested him. That was the last time I saw him. The same night, we crossed the river. I remember that my mom had been crying all day. We couldn't understand a word she was saying. She already knew what awaited my father. On that day, she lost her husband, her homeland, her state, and her means of support.
Dingo valstybė, dingo pragyvenimas, atsiradom...
We were left alone. Mr. Augustas, do you remember what happened to Skučas' and Povilaitis' family members who remained in Lithuania?
Šeimos likimas buvo toks, sulaukė vakaro, naktį jos...
Sunku prisiminti, taip?
Naktį jos buvo pervestos į Vokietiją.
At nightfall, both families were taken into Germany.
Kažkas padėjo.
It's painful to remember, isn't it? I cannot remember who helped them. A few days later, all of their belongings were taken into Germany as well. I was the one carrying their things to the border, together with a neighbor. At the border, we saw 3 soldiers that weren't ours. They were Russians. When father saw the soldiers walk away towards Pašventys, we took the things across the border and left them in the bushes.
Tai tėvelis nužiūrėjau, kai jie nuėjo Pašvenčių, tai mes dienos metu šitą vietą perdėšim visus daiktus. Į krūmus į vokiečių pusę čia priėmė vokiečių kontrolierius.
A German official took them, and that was it. At the school, which no longer exists, the soldiers kept their prisoners until morning. At 10 a.m., they were taken to the military prison in Kaunas. Kaunas, June 17th, 1940. Strictly confidential. To the director of the police department. According to the arrest warrant, the aforementioned individuals were taken into custody by the prison warden. Received by Captain Janitskas.
Taip, mama, kai sužinojau.
After my mother
kai
found out that he had been
suimtas,
arrested,
nes,
she couldn't stop crying.
Aš nežinau, per radiją pranešė, kaip tai.
Where did you live at that
mama
time?
labai verkė.
At Vinčai railway station.
Vinčų stoty.
Was it because your father worked there?
Vinčų stoty.
Yes, it was.
Tėtis dirbo.
Taip, tėtis dirbo.
Aha. O apie Skučo mamos.
O Skučo mamos.
reakcija.
What was the reaction of
Tai, kad
Kazimieras Skučas'
paskambino
mother?
iš Mauručių stoties kažkas, tai aš neprisimenu kas. Sako, mūsų mamytė, sako, labai plaukus
Someone
raunasi,
called from
sako,
Mauručiai railway station.
verkė labai ir
My mother said that
Sako,
Mrs.
iš
Skučas
proto
was
gali
devastated
išeit.
and cried the whole time. She
She
said she might go crazy. Somebody called you from Mauručiai railway station and told you how Skučas' mother was doing. What happened to her after that? My mother left by train. Your mother. Yes, she went from Vinčai station to Mauručiai station and went to the Skučas farmstead. She took her mother, Mrs. Skučas, and brought her back to Vinčai station.
Esame Kauno 6-ojo forto teritorijoje. Čia buvo
We are at the
karo
6th fort
kalėjimas
of
vadinamas.
Kaunas.
O dar tiksliau
This place was the so-called military prison,
kalbamės
specifically
su šio
the discipline
drausmės
section.
viršininku.
We are speaking with Irena Kazlauskaitė, the daughter of the former director of this particular
Irena
unit,
Kazlauskaitė.
Viktoras Kazlauskas.
Man atrodo, iš jūsų pasakojimų, kiek prisimenu,
As far as I can
teritorijoje
remember,
šio forto
you said that your
tos
family
nedidelės
lived here,
buvo
in the
ir
area
jūsų
of this
tėvų
section of the fort.
namai. Ir jūs
Your
čia
family
taip
used to
gyvenot.
have a house here.
Buvo šičia tie namai.
Yes, our house stood right there.
Buvo jau po pietų,
Now
kada
only ruins
paskambino
remain.
kažkas tai tėvui, ir jis
I remember it
labai
was after
susijaudinęs,
lunch that someone called my
pasakė
father.
mamai, sako,
Later, he said to my mother that Skučas and Povilaitis had been arrested and were about to be brought to the fort. My father and Skučas were friends. They were both volunteer soldiers when they came back from Russia. They were both officers. It was an awkward situation.
Nu, o kitą dieną jisai pas mus užėjo.
On the following day, Skučas came to our home.
Paruošė.
While my mom was
Ten
making
jie
lunch,
kalbėjo, ką
they
mes
talked.
nedalyvavom.
I didn't hear that conversation.
Nu, ir paskui
Later,
tai
my mother
mama
told me that
pasakojo,
Skučas
kad jis
asked her
paprašė,
to
kad
buy
jam
him a couple of
nupirktų
white shirts.
Porą baltų marškinių. Žodžiu, nu, vat, mama tą išpildė jo prašymą. Nu, jis
And my mother
buvo
did what he
mano
asked.
krikšto tėvas, tai
He was my godfather,
dažniau
so
tai
I knew him a
aš jį
little.
pažinojau iš-
He used to
iš
visit us
anksčiau,
on
visuomet
business,
atvažiuoja
or
pas
even
mus
sometimes
su
for no
reikalais,
reason.
tarnybiniais,
And he always
ar
brought us
taip,
candy.
tai visuomet
He was
mus
nice
pavaišindavo,
to
kartais
everyone.
saldumynus atveždavo,
He
jis
was
buvo
tall and
labai
handsome.
simpatiškas.
I remember I really liked that my
Ne,
godfather
ne,
was
jis
so
aišku,
handsome.
visiem. Nu, tu buvo aukštas, gražus, aš atsimenu, man labai patiko, kad mano toks krikšto tėvas gražus.
Jie sėdėjo
Were they
po
alone in their cells?
Man rodos, čia buvo laisvai
Yes,
galima vaikščioti,
they could
čia
walk
buvo
about during the day,
savaičių, o naktį
but at
tai
night they were probably guarded.
sargybinis turbūt stovėjo.
Po to, kai suimtieji buvo
After the
atvežti į
detainees were
fortą,
brought to the fort,
juos
they were
Kudėta
immediately visited by
aplankė į
Molotov's
Kauną
deputy,
skridęs
Dekanozov,
Molotovo
who flew in
pavaduotojas
from Moscow.
Jis norėjo
He wanted to be
būtinai
certain that
įsitikinti,
Skučas and
ar
Povilaitis had
Skučas
actually been
Povilaitis
arrested,
suimti ir
that the
ar
first
įvykdytas
condition of the
pirmasis
ultimatum had been fulfilled.
punktas. Žinoma,
He
jisai
saw it for
pasakė.
himself.
Zimonui ir man teko atlikti pirmąją.
Zimonas and I were tasked with conducting the first and the last interrogation of Skučas and Povilaitis. I asked that Skučas be brought into a separate room. Skučas came in wearing a nice dark suit and a clean white shirt, like a guest. Skučas denied all of the charges against him. Povilaitis also denied everything to Zimonas. Unfortunately, such responses were unacceptable during a Beria-style NKVD interrogation. On July 17, 1940, the newspaper Lietuvos Žinios wrote, "The Povilaitis and Skučas case has been transferred to the security department." This was an egregious violation of the Lithuanian law and courts, as well as the authority of the courts and the prosecutor's office.
Bei prokuratūros kompetencijos pažeidimas.
On June 23, 1940, Kazimieras Skučas and Augustinas Povilaitis were taken to the notorious Lubyanka prison in Moscow. Virginija Skučaitė was able to find the memoirs of Spiridonovas Lašas, deported together with them, published in a periodical called Savaitė, The Week, in 1942. The detainees were not taken from Kaunas railway station, but from a sidetrack of the railway in Aleksotas. Among the detainees were Colonel Dulksnys, Lieutenants Colonel Kirlys and Matusaitis, and others. They were transported in 2 railway cars, whose windows were completely blacked out with curtains. I was deported together with Skučas and Povilaitis. I shared my compartment with Skučas and Lieutenant Colonel Kirlys. At first, Skučas and Povilaitis were together in my compartment. But later someone decided they shouldn't sit together, so they took Povilaitis out and brought Kirlys in. From the memoirs of Juozas Averka, I was brought to the last compartment where General Kazys Skučas and Augustinas Povilaitis were sitting. Armed soldiers were standing next to our door. After some time, an inspector in civilian clothes showed up and dressed down the lieutenant for seating Skučas and Povilaitis together. Povilaitis was taken elsewhere, and Lieutenant Colonel Petras Kirlys was brought in. He was brought straight from prison, and his nerves were frayed. Skučas had a lot of trouble with him because of the constant shaking of his hands, which caused the handcuffs to cut into his wrists, causing him pain. Kirlys kept asking Skučas, "Kazimieras, please ask the lieutenant to loosen the handcuffs." Skučas asked the lieutenant, and the lieutenant loosened the handcuffs and tried to calm down Kirlys. But soon it was the same scenario all over again. I was surprised by how calm and soothing Skučas was. The train arrived in Minsk the following day. After dark, the detainees were moved to another car whose windows had bars on them. Throughout the trip to Moscow, the detainees were cruelly mocked. Moscow, I must say, had the operation planned out in advance. It wasn't just Lithuania. The same thing was done in Latvia and Estonia.
Vienu metu iš Latvijos, Estijos ir Lietuvos turėjo būti išvežti.
All top-ranking security and intelligence officers were supposed to be simultaneously deported from Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, following their simultaneous arrest a few days beforehand. They were to be arrested by the new security organizations, populated with communists and directed by NKVD secret agents that had been set up in these occupied countries.
Naujos saugumo struktūros, kurios buvo atkurtos jau okupuotose valstybėse. Ir operacija ši turėjo įvykti, tiesą sakant.
The operation was supposed to have taken place a few days earlier, but the Soviets decided to wait for some high-level officers to return to the Baltic states from missions abroad in order to arrest all of them at once.
Lygiai taip pat, kad bus galima susemti visus vienu metu.
However, not everything proceeded according to Soviet plans. For instance, Latvia's chief of military intelligence shot himself in his apartment. All the arrests were successful in Lithuania. In Estonia, only some of the planned arrests took place, because various officials had already fled to Finland. After the operation had been at least partially completed, all the detained officials were secretly and simultaneously taken from Tallinn, Riga, and Kaunas to Moscow. On September 13th and 14th, Skučas was interrogated in Moscow for the first time. They wanted him to admit that he not only masterminded the kidnapping of Red Army soldiers, but that he had been working as a Lithuanian spy while serving as Lithuania's military attaché in Moscow. Skučas refused to admit any of this. Nevertheless, on June 8, 1941, he was found guilty in a closed-door meeting of the Military Collegium of the Supreme Court of the Soviet Union and sentenced to be shot. We never knew what happened to him. When we lived in New York, everyone used to say that he was in Siberia. Historical monument, the NKVD Mass Execution Memorial, Komunarka. In this ground lie the remains of thousands of victims of Soviet political repressions from 1930 to 1950. May they never be forgotten. Using KGB archives, the international organization Memorial was able to identify 6,611 of the victims. They all met their fate in these secret mass graves. Every time I come here, I feel like you can cut the air with a knife in this place. All of my senses feel completely different here. It seems that even gravity works differently in this place. I am terrified of leaving the footpath in any direction. Even today, we still don't know where all the human remains lie. This Komunarka place used to be sort of taboo. It covers an area of 20 hectares, or 200,000 square meters. Most of the people, even the Russians, were unaware of what happened here. Some people say that this place is haunted by a spirit that makes visitors dreary and depressed because of the souls whose as yet unidentified bodies lie here. The story of this temple begins in 1999. Back then, this territory was sold to the Orthodox Church. From that day onward, Komunarka was open to everyone. Our duty is to preserve and take care of this territory. About 3 years ago, we started identifying the bodies, using georadars to detect the exact locations of the remains. Consequently, we were able to mark the places where bodies are buried. We marked them with poles, so their families would be able to pay respects to the dead. We are planning to build a memorial wall with the names of all of the victims that are buried here. It is important that people are coming to pray for the dead here every day. Update. The memorial wall was finished in autumn 2018. The designer of the wall is the grandson of Boris Pasternak.
Очень важно то, что совершается молитва ежедневно здесь, на этой территории. Это, можно сказать, одна из самых важных, можно сказать, дел.
It is so important that they are praying for everyone who is buried here, that all are mentioned. Were they only Orthodox? Of course not. Here lie people of many religions and nationalities. The NKVD plan was to eliminate members of various social classes. But the mass graves of Komunarka are also full of some extraordinary people, sentenced to death by the military collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR. The house behind me seems ordinary. Until the fall of the Soviet Union, nobody knew anything about this territory. The locals knew it, but even they were unaware of what had happened here. This is the vacation house of former Soviet Commissioner of the Interior, Genrik Yagoda. He used to spend his free time here before he was arrested. In the last days of the Soviet Union, people began talking about those who were persecuted and murdered. Eventually, they found out that this was the place where some of them were shot and buried. In the records of Nikolai Yezhov, we found Stalin's order to sell this house to the Chekist secret police for the aforementioned purposes. The Soviet government hid not only this burial place, but also the fact of the executions themselves. Officers were told what they should say to the families of the victims. The Soviets had special forms where they recorded what had actually happened to the victim and what his or her relatives had been told, in order to avoid getting tangled up in their own web of lies. Towards the end of the Soviet Union, the truth was finally being told in response to inquiries from relatives of foreign citizens shot here. Others found out during the Perestroika period. Most of those executed here were sentenced to death by the military collegium. It followed the commands of Stalin and a few of his henchmen. The NKVD prepared files for each of what was, in their view, an important case. The military collegium took up the cases only if they were signed by Stalin, Molotov, Kaganovich, Zhdanov, Voroshilov, or sometimes Mikoyan. Sometimes they made changes, for example, delayed someone's trial, or changed the sentence from imprisonment to shooting, or vice versa. The trials were short, about 15 to 20 minutes each. After sentencing, a prisoner wouldn't spend much more time in his cell. Usually, he was executed that same evening. After execution, they were taken to Kommunarka and secretly buried there. At the end of the 1930s and beginning of the 1940s, more well-known people were shot here in Kommunarka, following their roundup by the Soviets after the signing of the pact with Hitler and the beginning of the Soviet occupation of their countries. Most of the victims were actually well-known individuals. Of course, they lie here next to those lesser-known persons whom the NKVD considered their accessories. It was decided to maintain the historical look of this place, to build a fence identical to the one that had been here before. It has the same barbed wire and is of the same height. The concrete pillars and metal staples of the previous fence are all here. Even the planks are nailed together the same way. We preserved everything. How long is this fence? The fence is almost 2 kilometers long, 1,860 meters. And how big is the territory? The size of the area is around 18 hectares, or 180,000 square meters. This is a huge area, bigger than Butovo. God, it's hard to identify the beginning and the end of these trenches. It's supposed to be here. God only knows where they actually rest. Such horrors. It's hard to speak of them. I have been collecting information about my uncle Kazimieras Kučas for 30 years. But I finally found the place he was buried, only in winter of 2017. My friend and co-worker Violeta Yodeliene helped me to determine the place, using information we got from the Sakharov Center, Memorial, and the representative of the government of Moscow. Also, I am incredibly grateful to the Lithuanian Embassy in Moscow and the Genocide and Resistance Research Center of Lithuania. I am standing here today together with the center's representative because of their help and support. We have learned that about 150,000 Lithuanians are buried here, including interwar Lithuania's ministers, public officials, and public servants, like Kazimieras Skučas, Julijonas Čaplikas, and Antanas Tamošaitis, among others. On October 27, 2017, a capsule containing soil from Komunarka was buried in Mauručiai.